Let's go back to President Biden really invoking the powers of the UN to do something about Ukraine. Are they going to do anything about it?
It's very hard for the UN to act because the way to have effective action is usually through the Security Council. And Russia has a veto over anything the Security Council must approve, as does China. So the UN helped a little bit on the grain embargo that Moscow imposed on the shipment of Ukrainian grain, but that was only because Russia eventually agreed to it. Decisive action has to come from the United States.
In the meantime, we heard from President Putin of Russia overnight, and he both had what he calls, I guess, a partial mobilization. Is that right? As well as
Correct.
some pretty, I think, intended to be scary talk.
You're absolutely right. Putin has regularly invoked Russia's nuclear weapons in order to deter the United States and NATO and Ukraine from taking resolute steps to help defeat Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And this is more of the same. The partial mobilization enables Putin to pull in more troops without, in fact, conscripting people in Russia who don't want to fight. So it's only of limited political risk. The nuclear threat that Putin laid out, he laid out at the same time that he's endorsing sham referenda in parts of Ukraine that the Russians only partly control. So the idea is if these sham referenda include the result that a majority of people there want to join Russia, in theory, Russia may annex them. And Putin is intimating, but not stating explicitly, that his nuclear arsenal would be used to protect those lands. Again, the idea is to intimidate the United States and NATO out of sending to Ukraine the weapons they need to defeat the Russian aggressors in Ukraine.
So, Mr. Ambassador, how do we know when to take President Putin at his word and take him seriously? Because I drew the same conclusion you just said. You put together this sham election over in certain parts of eastern Ukraine to annex them into Russia with his statement that he would use, he didn't use the word nuclear, I don't think, but it was clear what he was talking about, for any invasion of Russian soil. Until now, we wouldn't be talking about that. But if they annex it, then he'll say, yeah, you're invading my soil if the Ukrainian forces try to retake those areas.
Look, we have to pay close attention to this because Russia is a peer nuclear power of the United States. But if you watch Putin's activities, he's always happy to threaten this because there's no risk in threatening. And in fact, he's gotten the United States to self-deter from sending weapon systems to Ukraine by this threat. Not in all cases, but in some. So there's no risk to Putin in threatening. There's enormous risk to him in actually doing. And we've seen him make the threat and then not carry through. For example, he said when Finland and Sweden expressed their interest in joining NATO months ago, he said, well, we could have a nuclear response. Well, NATO is now accepting Finland and Sweden, and you've had only a deputy minister of foreign affairs complaining about this. So that threat went out the window. Putin does not want to die in a nuclear holocaust. So the fact that he might threaten is one thing. The fact that he would actually do is another. We need to understand that.
What about the partial mobilization? How big a threat is that? I mean, it's something that I think President Putin didn't want to do because, in part, it conveyed even to his own people maybe things weren't going so well.
Well, keep in mind, he's had a dreadful 2 months. Remember, they promised to take all of Donbass in April and began an offensive to do that. And by the end of July, that offensive was stalled. Then the Ukrainians take back more territory in a counteroffensive than Russia has seized since last April. So those are 2 defeats in a row. Then Putin goes to Samarkand for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. He winds up apologizing to Xi, the leader of China, publicly for his Ukraine policy, and he's chastised publicly by his pal Modi, the leader of India. So he's had a dreadful several weeks. Now with this partial mobilization, which again does not threaten him politically in Russia, he can say, I'm doing something. And then he's hoping that this nuclear threat will stay our hand. I don't think it will. But the Biden team has at times been too timid when Putin has made that type of nuclear threat.
So let me ask the unfair question, but I think is all of our minds. How does this end? Because President Putin's going to have to come away saying to his people he got something from it. Ukraine's not going to want to give him anything at all. How does this end?
I think it ends when Ukraine takes back almost all the territory, if not all the territory that Moscow currently controls. Putin fully controls the Russian media. He could claim victory even if this were to happen. But keep in mind, some people want Ukraine to compromise by giving territory to Russia. But Russia has been conducting a war of war crimes with genocidal elements They've been torturing Ukrainian civilians, raping Ukrainian women, abducting Ukrainian children. So if Ukraine were to offer Russia territory, that means Ukraine is offering Russian millions of Ukrainians who can be tortured and worse. We cannot accept that. Ukrainians cannot accept it. And Ukrainian forces with American and NATO arms can win this war.
Mr. Ambassador, let me come back to where we started, which was President Biden in front of the United Nations General Assembly. At this point, will this go down as a failure of the United Nations? I mean, a lot of us who are not familiar with it the way you are thought that that's why the UN was there. And it's not clear that the UN is going to do anything about this.
The UN was created to help avoid circumstances like this. But as long as major powers have a veto in the UN National Security Council, major powers that conduct aggressive wars, the UN cannot serve that purpose. There are other things the UN can do which are helpful. So it has a role, but it's just not a role to be the arbiter of who is right, arbiter imposing a peace when a major power turns out to be an aggressor.
President Biden did call for what I took to be some reform in the United Nations, both saying we shouldn't use the veto so much. Now that I'm not sure how that enforceable it is, but also we should add to the permanent members of the Security Council. Is that a serious proposal for reform? Would that change things at all?
It is a serious proposal for reform, but still a very difficult one. Serious does not mean a successful one. The current permanent members of the National Security Council, of the UN Security Council, have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But in fact, the ideas about changing the UN Security Council have been around literally for a couple of decades. Maybe there will be reform in the future, but when is very hard to predict.